Total War and Those Not Prepared to Face It, by Interesting Unit 0. Galactic communities are a great thing, right? Everyone lives in peace, there are no times of strife anymore, commerce is flourishing, and the economy sees near unlimited growth, while at the same time, people are happier than ever. To our forebears, it seemed like the perfect solution to a problem that would have otherwise torn the galaxy apart. They even went a step further, ridding themselves of nearly all their warring history, wishing to bind future generations closer to our community by making them forget about the time before. But even they saw that there had to be a way for conflict to vent, for meetings, councils, and negotiations could only do so much. Our armies and navies were never fully demobilized. A token force remained, small in scale. Their purpose was to fight ritualized warfare on designated war planets. Small-scale engagements of forces of equal strength would fight. So was the idea, to prevent all-out warfare and resolve such conflicts with minimal loss of life. Some nations kept larger formations, but only one exceeded a 6-figure troop count, and that one only barely did so. A militarized police force was directly under the command of the community. Its sole job was to perform anti-piracy operations. Our militaries sometimes assisted them to gain experience in combat. But in doing so, we disregarded two things. 1. What if we ever met another species? And more importantly, 2. In a galaxy without weapons, the man building himself a sword is king. We had long traded in our swords for pocket knives, which is what we would find out. It started with breaking news. An unknown ship has suddenly appeared on the fringes of the galactic system in the Terran Republic, one of the largest members of the community. On board of that ship were members of a new species, carbon-based bipeds with soft skin, 2 arms, and 2 legs, and most of them having hair on top of their head. It took us a long time, but finally, the ship and us could manage to communicate. We learned that they were a science mission sent by their own nation, the Terran Empire. We also learned the name of their species, humanity. They asked us not to follow them back into their territory, as they would send a delegation our way. They had received instructions to establish diplomatic channels if necessary, so as they prepared to jump back into the massive region that we had previously thought had nothing in it, we smiled at their ship, its design clearly favoring efficiency and practicality over optics. But we were also excited. After all, we had just met a new intelligent life. When the delegation arrived as promised, we learned a great deal more about one another. We learned how fiercely protective they were of their territory, and were asked not to send any ships into it unless specifically invited. We agreed, understanding that there had to be a certain shock in meeting such a vast array of new nations. To show good faith, we still allowed them to move through our territory, which they gladly accepted. We also granted their request to build a series of gigantic starbases on the fringe of the galactic system, where the only hyperspace lane into their territory ended. They would serve as trading ports and meeting grounds, to ease diplomacy and trade between our governments. It was on these stations that I had the opportunity to meet the Terran Imperial couple. All seemed to go well, even though they still wished to exist outside of our community, retaining their independence. The cracks only began to show a few decades later. Our politicians had grown increasingly frustrated by the Terran refusal to join us. Some called them cruel for their punishment of the pirates, which were usually labor camps or execution. Even the most sincere apology for the actions of their pirates could not mask the cruelty in their punishment, officially, for insulting and harming a neutral foreign nation and risking the peace. And it continued. Fights on the Terran trading stations, a ban on the sale of Terran ship engines, tariffs. But the peak was reached when a powerful faction in the Galactic Senate held a speech demanding the Terran Empire open its borders and embrace the supreme authority of the Senate over even the Imperial couple, followed by thunderous applause. It was a direct insult of the Terran Empire. When the chair of the Senate finally restored order in the hall and moved to allow the Terran delegation to respond, they were nowhere to be found. The delegation had left, its staffers clearing out their offices and then leaving themselves. A period of uncertainty followed as the Terran Empire began severing ties with us. Humans on all worlds suddenly broke off their tents and returned back home. Joint initiatives were put on ice, and all non-humans were barred from entering the massive trade hubs. Then, a few days later, while the Senate was in session again, we received a transmission from them, to be played for the entire assembly. It was a message from their chief diplomats, telling us that for our insults towards them, the Terran Empire would declare war on all members of the galactic community. Outrage followed, but it was soon supplemented by fear. No one had ever gotten them to agree on our version of warfare. And then, we learned about the concept of total war again. A mere hour after we had received the transmission, the governor of the Kawakana system reported gigantic fleets entering their system. There were reports of orbital bombardments and planetary invasion. Civilian sensor arrays monitored more and more fleets entering the system, immediately vectoring for other hyperspace lanes to attack other systems. And the reports only grew in number, each describing similar events. It only took half a month, then the Terran Republic ceased to exist. It had looked like an exercise for humanity, as if it had been planned. Desperately, we had assembled our armies and police forces, setting up a rugged defense along the new border. Emergency laws were passed, implementing conscription and a new budget as we ourselves tried to start up the engines of war. But we lacked experience, planning, and logistical expertise. And so, when the Terran Empire resumed its offensive after a few weeks of consolidation, our resistance was as brave as it was futile. A counteroffensive ended in disaster as our forces got cut off from supply and lines of retreat, then engaged in a giant battle of annihilation. Terran sector fleets never used the same tactic, always fighting in a style that most effectively countered ours. Some sought defeat in detail, others fought giant, decisive naval engagements. It was never the same. We never stood a chance. Today, the Terran Empire controls a vast swath of the galaxy, about half the size of the entire galactic community. We are no longer permitted to colonize new planets or systems. Our military is monitored, and the Terran Empire has a veto in all matters discussed in the Senate. I, myself, am a hostage on this moon where I write these lines. We were unprepared for warfare of this scale. It was demonstrated to us within 1 year, killing billions and displacing trillions. Our forebears were fools.
Written by Ashalik Pranate de Vere, former chief diplomat of the Garkin Ascendancy, now in permanent house arrest on Luna in the Sol System.